All right, welcome to Canadian Agriculture Unpacked, brought to you by Footprint. As usual, our contact information is on the screen if you want to talk about an issue that you heard about on this show, or if you would like to be a guest on the show, please contact us. I have the privilege of introducing two guests today. I've got Jack Wilkinson, who's a tour de force in Canadian agricultural policy, former president of the Canadian Federation of Agriculture, the Ontario Federation of Agriculture, and the International Federation of Agriculture. And now he's a director on Canadian Cooperators. And then it's also my privilege that I have the opportunity to introduce Dr. Angela Rasmusson from the Vaccine and Infectious Disease Organization, commonly known as VIDO in Saskatoon. Welcome, Dr. Rasmussen. Well, could you tell us a little bit about VIDO?
Oh, sure. So VIDO is, it started off actually as the Veterinary Infectious Disease Organization, but it has now evolved into the Vaccine and Infectious Disease Organization. We're a research institute within the University of Saskatchewan here in Saskatoon. We operate one of North America's largest containment labs. We also have a vaccine manufacturing facility that can support up to phase 2 clinical trials for both veterinary and human vaccines. And we are currently in the process of building several new facilities, doing major infrastructure upgrades, including building a state-of-the-art animal facility, as well as upgrading to containment level 4, which is the maximum level of biocontainment that you can have. There's only one other lab in Canada with this level of containment. So our objective is to work on diseases that affect humans or animals or both. Our mission statement is healthy people, healthy animals. So VIDO is really unique in the sense that we can do a lot of these studies that require containment to develop novel vaccines and potential treatments for various emerging pathogens, either in smaller animal models or in cell culture, but we can also do it in larger animal models. So we can develop things like vaccines for livestock. We've done studies on H5N1. Some of my colleagues here have done studies on H5N1 in lactating cows, for example, which has been made possible by VIDO's incredible infrastructure. And that's just going to keep improving. So VIDO is the reason I came here, having coming from the U.S. and living previously in New York City and Seattle. Why would I come to Saskatoon to not be a girl from Saskatoon, but a middle-aged academic who was recruited to Saskatoon? The reason I did was because I thought it was really exciting to do world-class research with incredible colleagues in an institution that was positioning itself to be really instrumental in helping improve Canada's readiness and preparedness for pandemics and to increase vaccination. It really is a wonderful place to work. I'm really inspired by a lot of the work that my colleagues do, and it's a fantastic laboratory environment to work in. So VIDO is something that I think Saskatchewan's really proud of, and it's something that Canada should be really proud of too.
All right, thanks for that, Jack. You have anything you want to add or ask?
Oh, no, I mean, I'm just really interested. Are you doing much on the avian influenza as well as with dairy cows? You're also, and where kind of is the stage of a vaccine, if any, in that whole regard?
Yeah, so right now it's kind of early days with
Yeah.
that here in Canada. But because I'm from the U.S. and I also have an adjunct faculty appointment at Stony Brook University and I have a big presence in the U.S., I'm also extremely familiar with the U.S.,
Yeah.
the government, the way it works, and all of that. I've been more involved so far in what's going on in the U.S. with avian flu. Although I have done a little bit of work in Canada in terms of trying to assess the situation here. Some of my colleagues and I augmented the CFIA's efforts to test retail milk or bulk tank milk for H5N1, and I'm pleased to report that at least last summer we didn't find any, and CFIA to date has continued testing, and they haven't found any either. So Canada's dairy cattle, as far as we know, are free of H5N1. That said, Canada's had a number of outbreaks in poultry farms,
Yes.
and just as the U.S. has had, I can happy to talk about this a little more. But I think the Canadian response has actually been much better and more responsive to these avian outbreaks in poultry farms, egg laying operations, than it has been down south. Partly because we don't have the huge dairy cattle
Yeah.
problem, and the dairy cattle problem has now there have been 3 independent spillovers from birds into cattle that we know of in the U.S., in Texas, Nevada, and Arizona. There are constant bird outbreaks, although that hopefully will be leveling off a little bit since it's about to become bird migration season again. But it's something that I've been very much involved with a group of collaborators from really all over the world, but led by Michael Warraby, who's at the University of Arizona, and he's actually Canadian living in America. So we're kind of the opposites. I'm an American living in Canada, and he's a Canadian from BC who lives in the US. But
So,
what we've
so
done was we did a phylogenetic analysis on the sequences of those viruses that have been found in the cows, as well as viruses that have been found in birds and in people. And we were able to determine essentially when those introductions to cattle occurred.
Okay.
For example, we know that the first cattle introduction was not detected for 3 to 4 months. And the USDA has actually done an analysis that essentially found the same results that we did. So I've been working on it in that capacity, but I am about to, pending funding, start my own H5N1 influenza experimental research program here too, much as my colleagues have already done.
let's back up a little bit. So the AI broke out in the U.S. Now, I know everybody in the U.S. is blaming either Biden or Trump for the shortage of eggs. And of course, we know better than that. In fact, I found it really interesting. And I mean, we all know about the new administration. I heard the Secretary of Agriculture in the U.S., I think on Fox, encourage people to start backyard flocks for eggs. And I mean, we all know that that could exacerbate the very problem that started the egg shortage in the first place. But when did it break out in the U.S.? When did it start?
So this is a really difficult question to answer. And maybe I'll just actually go back to kind of the beginning. And that's the beginning of the panzootic, which is a pandemic in animals, and in this case, in birds. So in 2020, 2021, H5N1 panzootic essentially began. Migratory birds in Eurasia were infected with it, and as they fly around and migrate, they bring it with them. Many of these migratory bird species actually do not have severe illness after infection. Ducks, for example, are fine just flying around and eating and mingling with other birds when they get it. So it makes it very easy to transmit from one place to another. In 2021, the current clade 2344B viruses that are circulating now was introduced to North America. Actually, in Canada, the first detection was in Atlantic Canada and Newfoundland, I believe. And it has spread throughout North America and South America from there. There were bird outbreaks in poultry operations throughout North America and also throughout Europe and Asia since this began. And each bird outbreak in a poultry operation is really a separate introduction from either wild birds or from another infected farm. And so those are a little bit different than the cow situation. And those would occur sporadically up until, and they still are occurring sporadically, but up until December, November of 2023. And that's when, according to our analysis and the USDA's analysis, it spilled over from birds into cows in Texas, most likely. And because that outbreak was undetected, we just didn't really have cows on our radar. Other people in the past had tried to infect cows with other influenza subtypes and never really got productive infection via the respiratory route. I'm not sure that anybody ever looked by the intramammary route of transmission, but cows were just not thought to be candidate for being a host for H5N1. But in this panzootic, what we've seen is periodic cross-species transmissions into mammals. There have been an increasing number of die-offs of marine mammals, first in South America, but now up and down the coast of South and North America. There have been a number of wild animals, largely carnivores, that have been identified as well. So there are grizzly bears, foxes, raccoons, skunks, and of course, domestic cats. There was a dog in Canada that died after chewing on a dead goose in Ontario. So this virus does have the capability to jump from birds into mammalian hosts. And when it did this with cows, because it wasn't detected for so long, and there's a lot of interstate transport in the U.S. of dairy cattle, that meant that basically it got sent all over, exported from Texas all over the U.S. Into, initially it was, I believe, 11 states, and now we're up to, I think, 17 states, nearly 1,000 infected herds in the U.S. And a large part of that was the fact that it wasn't detected and there weren't any biosecurity measures put in place to prevent it prior to April.
Do they depopulate dairy cattle when they get it?
No, so dairy cattle actually don't get that sick most of the time. Some of them can get quite sick, but it's not the most common outcome. Oftentimes they have no clinical signs of disease, and the way that they were actually first detected was not because cows were starting to get really, really sick. It's because milk production was being affected, and some of the milk quality was also being affected. So one way you can tell if a cow's sick is with H5 is if their production dries up, and also the milk might be kind of a strange texture. It's kind of chunky and yellowish, and I mean, it sounds incredibly unappetizing. But that was how it was identified first, because it wasn't meeting FDA quality standards.
Just before I go to Jack, it seems to me, I think we had an bad outbreak in BC in 2003, 2004. And it seems to me back then they actually depopulated healthy chicken flocks to create a buffer zone. Is that correct?
That I don't know. I'm going to have to look into that, because I actually just realized that I don't know necessarily about a lot of the history of H5N1 or avian flu in Canada. But to date, certainly depopulation is the way to go, except in the U.S. now it sounds like it might not be, which I think is a terrible idea, and I'm happy to expand on that further. I think that, one thing that was never tried in North America, but could potentially be tried now, is vaccination. And that's always been less appealing because there are sort of arbitrary import controls that some countries place on products from vaccinated birds, which doesn't really make sense, because there's other vaccines that they give chickens that, like for Newcastle disease virus, for example, that's not a problem at all. But I think the only way that you can really address this without doing some form of depopulation is with vaccination. And I will say that in China and Mexico, both, where they have used vaccination very effectively for years, vaccination is really a strategy that going forward, both Canada and the U.S. should consider with regards to both chicken and dairy cows.
So which part of it did you agree with in the U.S.? Sorry, maybe I missed that.
Oh, well, there's a lot of things I didn't agree with about the U.S. response previously, and there's a lot more things that I disagree with right now. With the current USDA plan, Secretary of Agriculture Brooke Rollins has said that they're devoting $1 billion to controlling avian flu in the U.S., but they don't really address the cow outbreak at all. It's entirely for poultry outbreaks, and the purpose of it is to reduce egg prices, which is understandable. And H5N1, not Trump or Biden, is the cause of the increased egg prices. Because if you depopulate a whole farm, guess where you get your new chickens from? from eggs. And actually also guess how we make flu vaccines in eggs. So the shortage of eggs really is due to H5N1 on multiple levels. Nonetheless, I think that depopulation is absolutely necessary. And so this new plan is devoted to increasing biosecurity, which I fully support. But it also kind of relies on the fact that that increased biosecurity will obviate the need for culling or depopulation should there be an outbreak. And it's not completely clear on that, I will say, but several reporters have asked me about that and have told me that was the intent that we, and actually Health and Human Services Secretary Robert F. Kennedy Jr. said the other day in an interview with Sean Hannity on Fox News that if we didn't cull, then the surviving chickens would be like extra strong. But this is why I disagree with that approach, because an highly pathogenic avian influenza is called highly pathogenic because of what it does in chickens specifically. And in chickens, it is a gastrointestinal disease as well as a respiratory disease, and it kills them, and it kills almost all of them. It's typically uniformly lethal. It's very fast. And so what you will have in a barn that you're not depopulating, you just let them all die of avian flu, is you're creating a horribly inhumane situation for those chickens. You're also basically making every single one of those chickens into a virus factory that is going to be bleeding, having diarrhea all over the place, all over that barn. And then people are going to have to come in and remove those carcasses. And in some U.S. operations, that can mean hundreds of thousands or millions of chickens. And you're going to have people doing that. They're basically going to be walking around in a barn full of dead chickens that are full of virus, covered in bloody diarrhea from those chickens that is absolutely full of H5N1 virus. So it creates a huge hazard for those people.
And it is zoonotic, right?
It is zoonotic. And so the main thing about an avian flu pandemic, and Jack, I can see you were ready to jump into this conversation. So I'm going to shut up in a second. But the main risk of a pandemic is that in the U.S., we've had 70 confirmed human cases of H5N1. The vast majority of them have been either dairy or poultry workers. Poultry workers are at greatest risk when they are depopulating a flock. Decontaminating a barn after letting H5N1 run its course will put them at an even higher exposure risk. And the big concern for pandemics is that in a human, the virus will adapt to that human host, and it could potentially adapt to be efficiently transmitted between people, which it's not right now, or at least we don't have any evidence that it is right now. So the more human cases you have, the greater the risk that a virus will emerge from this that is capable of efficient human-to-human transmission. And then because of some of the changes in the U.S. government on the human side, we might not detect that right away. And that could certainly lead to a pandemic, and that could lead to a pandemic with worse consequences than the COVID-19 pandemic.
Jack.
Yeah, you're right. I wanted to get in. I mean, what you've raised is just a multitude of problems. I heard some information coming out of the U.S. the other day in relationship to the government cutting research for vaccine. It was mainly human-oriented, but one has to jump to the conclusion, what you're describing now, of also within livestock, birds, etc., the inability to understand how this works from a science-based situation is really problematic, as well you've described. And it runs, I think, an incredible risk of sweeping across the United States in a very dramatic way. And that creates lots of problems for Canadian farmers. I'm a farmer as well. If this isn't a reason to close down a border, I honestly don't know what it is. And I'm not being flippant about this. We know what happened with BSC. The U.S. basically ignored the fact that they had it for years. They cut cattle off. We weren't able to ship anything into the States, appropriately so. We had to cut it off. We had to depopulate. We had to deal with it. We did. I think the protocols on most farms are pretty advanced in Canada. This is going to be one of these very good opportunities that most of our farms are relatively small in comparison to the U.S. model. They're family run, generally speaking. relatively easy contained by comparison, and I think it'll prove to be an upside in our dealing with it. But this really does scare the hell out of me, quite frankly. I mean, to have people ignoring science in the view of a livestock pandemic that has already jumped in the human population is about as risky as it gets. It's like turning the clock back 5 years and starting again as if we learned absolutely nothing. And in fact, the problems that developed out of the last pandemic was this sense of a certain percentage of the population that somehow drinking bleach cured it. And I'm trying not to be political here, but this is just one of these places that should never have politics involved at all. I think there's tons of people. This is an opportunity for the brain drain to come to Canada. And listening to that article, podcast the other day, the number of universities, scientists who are wondering what their future work's going to be like in the United States with the federal government, the way it's acting towards this, and musing about coming to Canada. I hope they all come, because we're going to have a very serious problem on our hands.
You'd like to respond to that, or to Dr. RFK's ability to handle the issues?
I can respond to both. I completely agree with everything that Jack just said. I have those same exact concerns. I mean, to me, and they're related to what RFK Jr. has said. I mean, the fact is, the U.S. is currently moving towards a system where our public health and our animal health and our agricultural decisions and our policies are being decided by ideological standards rather than scientific ones or based on scientific evidence. One example is that I didn't even get to when talking about the USDA's current new plan, is that there is $100 million allocated to developing and exploring, I think is the word that's used, new vaccines, next generation advanced vaccines. And so that is good. But the Secretary of Agriculture does not seem to be aware that a vaccine made by Zoetis for poultry was conditionally approved by the USDA 2 days after she was confirmed as the Secretary of Agriculture. And that's disturbing, because either she somehow doesn't know about it, or she is pretending not to know about it. Certainly the things that RFK has said, I mean, he promised Senator Bill Cassidy that if he was confirmed, he would continue with vaccines the way that they are, and would not interfere with that, and would use a science-based approach. And as soon as he was confirmed, he basically indicated to everybody that he was lying about that, because there's currently a huge measles outbreak occurring in Texas that has now spread to New Mexico and Oklahoma. New cases have appeared in New York and LA. And it's entirely among unvaccinated people. And it took him multiple days to even tell people that vaccination was an option, even though it was a personal choice. He has now made completely unscientific and unproven recommendations that cod liver oil, vitamin A, and steroids and antibiotics are alternatives to measles vaccination. And I want to say this very clearly, even though measles is not an agricultural disease, vaccinate your children against measles. And if you've never been vaccinated against measles, get a vaccine against measles, because measles is a potentially deadly and permanently disabling virus, and 2 people have already died from this measles outbreak. But the fact is that RFK Jr. makes quite a lot of money being anti-vaccine. And he is making recommendations with regard to the food supply, which is within his department of the U.S. government's jurisdiction. Such as, we're going to relax regulations on raw milk consumption. And certainly dairy workers have gotten H5N1 from being splashed in the face with raw milk. It's unclear how susceptible humans are by this route, but cats who drink raw milk with H5N1 in it die almost uniformly of severe neurological disease. And so we not only have somebody in a very influential position in the cabinet in the U.S. government who is acting on political ideology rather than science, who is personally profiting, and his financial disclosures said that he wasn't going to divest in getting profits basically from these vaccine safety cases that he recommends to an anti-vaccine law firm, and then they sue the vaccine manufacturers, and he gets a cut of any settlement that's made. So he has a financial interest in opposing vaccination, and now he's opposing vaccination that he doesn't even really have the standing to oppose, because that's the U.S. Secretary of Agriculture's job to decide, and it's really terrifying. And I mean, just because we're in Canada and it's a different country, and Canada is still, using really strong evidence-based methods. Both CFIA and PHAC are always very clear and transparent about their policy recommendations and the evidence that that's based on. We might be here in a country that's sort of operating normally, but the U.S. is our neighbor, and it's one of the largest land borders in the world. And this is spread by birds that fly. So if there's a pandemic that begins in the U.S., it's not going to be restricted to the U.S., and it's going to potentially have a huge impact on both the Canadian people and Canadian agriculture.
Bob, just on this point before I stay quiet for a moment, it's my understanding from some of the research that's being done on avian outbreaks in BC that their concern basically is that it's being transmitted through the air. So in the old days, and I'm not a poultry farmer, I mean, the sense was if you could screen your barn, if you watch your protocols, if you made sure that you basically went through baths and changed your clothes, all these things, chances are it wasn't going to get into your flock. But this more recent work is effectively talking about trying to design filtration systems that are going to be able to, and I don't know if this is even possible, but to deal with the virus, because the feeling is it's airborne. How far it can travel in the air is an open-ended question, but that's the only way they can find that it's entering some of the barns that they found in BC last year. So I don't know if you've done work on that, but all of this starts to really, do state governors have any control over quarantine measures within their states themselves so that they can override what the feds are doing if, in fact, they understand how bad this is getting?
They do, and we've seen this in the cattle outbreak. It varies a lot from state to state. So in some states that are supposedly cow infection free, we've seen new infections pop up, and they're all the B313 genotype, which is the one that spilled over into the cows in Texas. Yeah. So this is another thing that I didn't really get into. There's multiple genotypes. Basically, there's multiple H5N1 viruses that are spreading around. There's two major genotypes circulating in North America right now, D1.1 and B313. D1.1 is typically the virus that gets into birds from other birds, although now there have been 2 cow spillovers of D1.1 as well. But the original Texas spillover was from B313, and because that outbreak spread so widely around the country, almost every single cow sequence that we got up until January, when the first D1.1 spillover into cows was detected, was from that original spillover in cows. And so this has created a situation where it is just so widespread, and there are so many different viruses around, that it does make it really difficult to try to, and I don't work on, aerosol transmission, but it makes it really difficult to figure out like where the virus might be coming from in many cases, because birds have it, like wild birds have it, wild mammals have it, cows have it. Cows are giving it back to birds, who might be then giving it back to, not cows, at least as far as we know yet, but giving it to other birds, other wild animals. And now people are potentially getting all of this, and it's really a dangerous situation. I mean, we've never been this close to having an avian flu pandemic since H5N1 really emerged in people.
Jack and I have done an awful lot of work on the Hill and in the agricultural department, and we used to say that there are people that don't know, and they don't know that they don't know. And they were the problems. And I think we have a fair bit of that going on in the U.S. When I was a turkey producer in Manitoba, And I think, I don't know how many years ago this is. I believe we had a small outbreak of AI in Manitoba. And I was walking from the farm, and my turkeys were all confined. I was walking from the farm to where I lived, and I saw a flock of cormorants landing on the river, and I was just petrified. Like everybody was so tense because, I mean, cormorants are kind of known to spread disease, right? But the other look, we have a good biosafety protocol going, biosafety security protocol going, don't we, in Canada?
In Canada, yeah, I think the biosecurity is generally very good. And, just like in the US, so it can vary from state to state. And different states, I mean, I guess to finish kind of answering the question before, because I just realized that I didn't sort of get into this. Some states are going to be very proactive. They have very proactive animal health departments that are going to be right on top of this. Other states might be incentivized to not test at all and pretend that it's essentially not a problem, especially in cows, because again, it doesn't kill the cows usually. Pretty hard to cover up an avian outbreak in chickens and turkeys, however. But in Canada, a lot of this is decided nationally, and CFIA definitely makes excellent recommendations about biosecurity practices. Most Canadian farms, and Canadian farms are generally not as large as they are in the US as well. I mean, there are not, as far as I know, anyways, there are not like commercial flocks of millions of birds in Canada. They're much smaller than that. And so it just like in the US, there's also not a ton of enforcement about these biosecurity procedures because CFIA is not, well, there is and there isn't. And I'm going to let you correct me, Jack, because you guys would know better than me. But my understanding, and I got this in part from talking to officials at CFIA, as well as from testifying before both Parliament and the Senate about this, is that the CFIA has the authority to inspect and to make recommendations and correct, but they don't have enforcement capability. And so I think that if there's breaches in biosecurity, it's the individual farm level. It's not because of CFIA, because I think our policies are quite good and evidence-based. But Jack, tell me why
No,
I'm wrong.
no, we've got a different farm organizational structure in Canada, which has served us incredibly well in the past, historic. So every one of the commodity organizations have got elected officials at the provincial and at the national level. They're very, very, very involved in what goes on the farm. They're farmers of that particular commodity. They are elected by larger groups of farmers, et cetera. And whether it was anything that we've done historic from environmental on through to animal welfare, the list of things, they become very, very involved at the local farm level to both give the information, be part of the disciplinary factor, and we really work as a group. Now, there are exceptions to all those rules, but that really allows us in a situation like this to move very quickly. We know who the producers are. The provincial government has my producer number on my farm. Every farm has it. The commodity organization does. We can shut down things pretty quickly. And in fact, for milk and others, we have inspection services that report to CFIA in addition to CFIA that also can do some monitoring. So I think we're in a much, much better position of wanting to solve this problem versus ignoring it. So I'm hopeful in that regard. Just one last question from you on the science, well, not last, but on the science piece. Because the U.S. dairy industry moves around a lot more. I mean, we have some dairy farms that just bring in cows prior to milking and then they're sold afterwards or whatever. But a lot of our dairy farms will have, they'll calve it out on the farm, they'll raise them, they'll come into the production. They can't have a closed unit if they want or to much higher degree. Hence, there's less traffic of dairy animals on the road to different farms. There's still some for sure. But do we have a test at the border that we can do a quick test on any importation? Because that's going to be the next issue. I mean, what do we do? Assume everything from the United States is infected and you close down a border? Or do we test in a way prior to with protocols so we can still have a sensible movement of breeding stock at minimum without have the threat of infection?
Yeah, so that's a great question. In the U.S., once the cattle outbreak was discovered, and it wasn't immediate, but on April 29th, I believe, 2024, the USDA put in place a requirement for testing animals before they were moved from state to state. And now my understanding is that that has now been moving from farm to farm. So there's less transport. But I guess what I'm not completely clear on is if that's only for lactating cows or if that's breeding stock or what. Um, Now, Canada also put into place import controls, and I think those are pretty robust. So the USDA export certificate on cows coming into the US or coming into Canada have to be tested before being moved in. There's not really a rapid test that has been validated or developed like for testing cows on the spot, and I think actually it probably wouldn't be a very good application for a rapid test because I think you do need to use a validated molecular diagnostic for the sensitivity um, to test the cows. But there is requirements from both the Canadian and the U.S. side for testing before moving cows around.
Now, that testing, does it go into a national database so that, in fact, we know the movement, we know the volume, the intensity, the severity, who seems to have it under control, or is that kind of held at the state level? And do you have a sense of that?
So this is a big difference between Canada and the US because my understanding is that in Canada, every cow gets a tag, an ear
Yeah.
tag, and has an identifier so they can actually be tracked. In the US, that does not happen. I don't know about within individual states, but there is no way to track like the movement of a single cow within the US from state to state. And this has actually been a problem, I think, in terms of maintaining the cattle outbreak.
Yeah.
And certainly there's a disincentive because it took the USDA a long time to put the ELAP program in place, which is basically an indemnification program for production losses. It took a long time for that to actually be put in place where they could actually start compensating producers for their losses. So for many producers, uh, there was not really a big incentive to say, "Oh, would you come test my farm for H5N1? I would love to have my whole farm shut down and no more production." So if they have a cow that gets H5N1, and these are anecdotal stories I've heard, but I believe them because there's every reason in the book why a farmer would want to approach it this way, and they're not getting good information or support that they need from the government. Is that rather than testing, they see a cow that seems to have H5N1, their production goes away, slaughter that cow for meat and replace it. And by replacing it with a naive cow that has never been infected before, congratulations, you just got another infected cow on your farm. And that outbreak is going to continue and it's not going to go away. And as I mentioned, they aren't culling the dairy cows, they are isolating them and isolating farms that are affected until there's no more detections of H5N1, and then they can resume production if the cows get their production back,
Yeah.
which it's not clear that they always do. But this has been because every state is regulating this differently. There's no way to require farmers to test their individual cows unless there's already evidence that there's H5 on that farm. So there's a real disincentive, and this is one of my criticisms of the Biden administration's response to H5N1, is that they really needed to get those compensation programs in place earlier so that producers would not be facing financial ruin essentially if they were to collaborate and participate in containment.
Well,
That's
Bob, you'll remember in China that was the same time issue many years ago, and it was small flock producers. The government wouldn't compensate. So here you have almost subsistence farmers. That's when I was at the international level, who were really asked to give up their entire livelihood for the good, in quotation mark, of the state with no compensation, with no repopulation. And so it went on forever and got much worse because of that, what you're just describing in the U.S. Sorry, Bob, for interrupting.
no, it's okay. It strikes me that that some of this may have to do with the structure of the industry too. I mean, in Canada, because we have uh, independently owned farms by single farm families, we're not as vertically integrated as they are in the U.S. So if a chicken producer, a dairy farmer, they are very dogmatic about their biosecurity because it hits their own pocket if they're not careful enough. In the U.S., because they're so vertically integrated, they have farms with millions of chickens. They're probably just all employees on the farm, so they don't have the same kind of keenness to make sure that they follow strict biosecurity protocol. The other thing I wanted to say is, my guess is a lot of the spread also has to do with external service people, right? It's not necessarily the farmers. The farmers control the traffic pretty well, but it could be people driving in and out, maybe salespeople, maybe feed truck deliveries, or feed deliveries. And a story that we heard when it happened in BC in 2003 and 2004 is the transport drivers that would go pick up culled birds on the chicken farm. They parked their trailers overnight on parking lots sometimes, and people drove by and literally saw blood dripping from the trailers, right? And those kind of things, I mean, they don't help. And of course, it exacerbates the problem. So
Okay.
the other thing I'm really surprised about, I thought if we were going to talk about avian influenza, most of the discussion would be about poultry, but we've actually spent more time on dairy. So it's there isn't a lot of poultry that's been infected in Canada. Is that correct? And
So
we're
there,
talking more about the potential in dairy than actual cases in dairy?
so so there's no cases in dairy in Canada as far as anybody's aware. Monitoring for that continues, just because the experience in the U.S. has shown how quickly it can spread through a herd and the danger that that presents to dairy workers, and potentially the danger to the food supply. Although in Canada, the rules are a lot stricter about pasteurization. So than they are in the U.S. So in the U.S., basically, you don't have to pasteurize milk unless you're going to transport it across state lines for sale. Some states have laws that require pasteurization, but according to the FDA, the main rule that prohibits it is this prohibition on interstate transport, as well as FDA requirements that you only can sell things nationally if they've been pasteurized. So I'm less worried about the dairy in Canada, actually, but there have been poultry outbreaks throughout Canada since this panzootic started. Basically, since 2021, there have been poultry outbreaks. People, my colleagues all over Canada, are detecting lots of viruses in birds. They're sequencing them. Now in the U.S., the USDA does provide sequences, and they upload them to a database, which is how me and my colleagues have done some of our work to try to trace back when these spillovers occurred. We do that by looking at the sequences and looking at the mutations, and then we can sort of time like when that emerged from the birds into the cows. And same thing with a poultry outbreak. We can figure out like that came from, this group of viruses that was circulated in this group of wild birds, and now it's in this particular flock of chickens. So there have been poultry outbreaks throughout this. As I said before, every poultry outbreak, for the most part, is an independent spillover from wild birds, or it is brought in, like Jack was saying, potentially either from a person or potentially traveling on wind currents. There's also been a lot of discussion about how easy it is to move from place to place on equipment, vehicles, things like that. So Canada has not escaped avian flu. And as you might have seen in the news last fall, there was a teenager in BC who got it from an unknown source and probably from a bird. But people actually interact, you probably know, as farmers, people interact with wild animals a lot more than they realize. you could have a bird poop on you and get H5. It would be pretty unlucky, but it could happen. Anyways, that teenager was so sick. That teenager should have died, honestly, if there weren't heroic life-saving measures taken to save that kid. And I'm so glad that they did. But we definitely have H5N1 high path avian flu here affecting Canada's birds, affecting Canada's people potentially. And it's something that, I'm less worried being in Canada because we are vigilant. And I think both PHAC and CFIA are being very proactive about the measures that they are taking to try to be on top of this.
So that vigilance has paid off, right?
Well,
They've
before
been localized, but go ahead, Jack.
no, just before we wrap, because we must be getting close to that time. Could you just give us a
Getting
quick
there.
summary of the state of play of vaccine, both in birds? You mentioned China and Mexico, and the availability of it, and the potential, and how far off are we for livestock? Just so we can end with some hope here, hopefully.
Yeah. No, it's a great question. It's ever since 2004, I think, 2005, Mexico has been using vaccines to limit poultry infections with H5N2, avian influenza. In 2017-ish, China was having all these problems with H7N9 outbreaks, which is another subtype of high path avian flu. And they were culling so many animals, and there were so many human infections. And H5 or H7N9 can be deadly in people as well. That they decided to use a bivalent vaccine that protects against both H5 and H7 subtypes of influenza in birds. And the reason why this hadn't been tried before was the experience in Mexico showed that these vaccines aren't completely sterilizing. So some birds can still get infected with them. And the viruses that would emerge from these birds could start new outbreaks, and unvaccinated, they could theoretically be transmitted to people, and they might be evasive to the immunity that is elicited by the vaccines. And they did find that in Mexico. But then they tried it. They were losing so many birds and having so many human infections in China. They said, basically, let's try it anyways. And so they put out this bivalent vaccine, and they had a pilot program in Guangzhou. And it was actually amazing, like what the results were, to the point that now these vaccines are mandatory in China for all poultry farms. And what they found was that, yes, they weren't completely sterilizing. And yes, new viruses emerged that could kind of evade the vaccine immunity a little bit. But they found that they were actually were evolving to become more specifically just for birds and not for people. They also effectively stopped these outbreaks on the bird farms without culling. So even though these other viruses came out, you might need to keep changing the vaccine. These vaccines actually did work to protect the chickens. And vaccines, it's important, I think, for people to keep in mind that vaccines were intended to stop disease, not necessarily to stop infection. And these vaccines basically eliminated transmission to humans. They saved these flocks from culling. They kept production going. And as a result, now these vaccines are mandatory in China. In the summer of 2023, European producers were having so many problems with having to depopulate all of their farms that they started demanding, like, we would like to start vaccinating now. And so they did. And I think the pilot studies are going pretty well. I haven't seen all of the data. And so for that reason, in the U.S., and we'll just end on this hopeful note, in the U.S., they also started exploring the idea during the Biden administration. And now there is a vaccine that's manufactured by Zoetis, as I mentioned before, that has conditional approval for use in chickens. And it has a lot of industry support as well. In addition to that, there are ongoing field trials of a couple other vaccines, including other vaccines for birds, as well as vaccines for cows. And those studies are in progress. So I think that I'm the co-editor-in-chief of the journal Vaccine, and I work at the Vaccine and Infectious Disease Organization. So anytime I hear about a lot more potential vaccines that would really make a difference here, both for the animals as well as for the producers who are depending on these for the economy, and for Canadian consumers and American consumers who are depending on these animals to produce their food. I think it really is a win-win-win. In the U.S., my hope is that we'll have some more sensible heads prevailing in terms of the policy making so that we can actually use these vaccines for vaccination campaigns. And the good news there is that industry does seem quite supportive of incorporating these vaccines into our influenza prevention strategies. So I think that things are going to improve the more we can do vaccination of animals as well as potentially for people.
Well, I mean, the other positive thing out of this is it's AI seems to be ever present. It's waiting. It's always waiting in the wings to attack. But our vigilance and our biosecurity protocols, I obviously have prevented from very, very large outbreaks in Canada in the recent past, for sure. Jack, you had one more?
No, I'm have all my questions answered. I'm good.
Well, you know something, if you can answer all of Jack's questions, you know you've done a good job. I have one more question.
Yeah.
How often do you have a serendipitous discovery of a vaccine?
A serendipitous discovery of a vaccine. Boy.
In other words, you're looking for a vaccine for something specific, and then suddenly you in that process you come upon something that says, "Wait a minute, this is going to work for something else." I know that there was one case in VIDO years ago, but I can't remember what it was.
So I don't know that story, and it might just be because I'm still fairly new to Canada. I haven't been here for 4 years, but I'm trying to think of an example because nowadays, vaccine design is certainly a lot more sophisticated than it used to be. We have all these new vaccine technology platforms. We can design vaccines without sort of resorting to the old-fashioned way, which was grow up the virus or attenuate the virus and use the virus to vaccinate people. That still is the prevailing technology that's used for influenza vaccines. They've improved it a little bit because some of them are now grown in cell culture, but for the most part, these vaccines are still produced in eggs and they're inactivated vaccines, so they're basically just inactive flu virus particles. With something like that, maybe you find out that your flu vaccine, and that's actually the opposite situation for flu, but maybe you find out that it protects against some other subtype of flu, or maybe you find out that it protects against more flus than you thought it was going to. And actually, the original development of a vaccine, and this has relevance to agriculture, was the reason why vaccines are called vaccines is because the first vaccine is a virus called vaccinia virus because it was infecting cows in 18th century rural England. And Edward Jenner, who is a countryside physician, observed that the milkmaids who were milking the cows would get these pustules on their face that looked a lot like smallpox pustules, but they weren't smallpox. So he, in an experiment that we would never do today, because it would be incredibly unethical, but it worked, he scraped these pustules off of these milkmaids' faces and injected them or scarified them into a 10-year-old boy. And then he exposed the kid to smallpox pustules. And he didn't get smallpox. And so they realized that vaccinia virus, and they didn't know it was a virus, of course, at the time. They didn't know what viruses were. But he observed that the pustules that were caused by vaccinia virus infection in these milkmaids would prevent against smallpox infection. And that's because they're both orthopox viruses that are related to each other and they produce cross-reactive immunity. So the first discovery of a vaccine was actually quite serendipitous, even though Edward Jenner, the physician who did it, didn't realize what he was actually doing. That led to, 200 years later, the eradication of smallpox.
That is a great story to end on, but I know the viewers have one more question. Can you get AI from drinking the milk?
I don't know. Not pasteurized milk. Pasteurized milk is completely safe, and that has been shown. What we don't know is if people can efficiently get H5N1 from drinking raw milk. Personally, I wouldn't take the chance. I know that cats can get it, raccoons can get it, animals that live around farms can get it from consuming milk. And we need more work on this to understand really that transmission route. But if it were me, well, I don't want listeriosis or campylobacter or salmonella either, so I don't drink raw milk. But if people are worried about this, drink pasteurized milk and you'll be fine, because we don't know if you can get it from drinking raw milk.
That's certainly easy enough. Thank you so much, Dr. Rasmussen.
Yeah, it's a real
You
pleasure.
have answered a lot of questions. Thank you, Jack, for the questions you asked. I just want to remind the viewer that the next episode, we will be talking about canola within the dynamics of the U.S. tariffs, etc. And we will have as our guest Roger Charlebois from Alberta, the chair of Canadian Canola Growers Association. Thanks again.